This video is sponsored by Stack Audio, manufacturers of the Orva speaker and equipment isolation feet used by a British audiophile. For more information about these and other products, please click the link in the description. Well, this is going to be a bit different. My first entire system review. It's only taken me 4.5 years. Mixing and matching components is part of the fun of hi-fi, but sometimes in order to understand a manufacturer's sonic intentions, you really need to take a look at their entire system. AudioNote fall into this category, an entry system comprising a source, amp, speakers, speaker cables and interconnects will set you back around £7 grand. But they also have cost no object systems where you won't receive any change out of £1 million. I know, how many people can afford that kind of outlay? Their systems are structured from level 0 all the way up to level 6. As you go up the levels you access better quality components and purer design topologies. As far as I can tell, their philosophy is centered around 3 guiding principles. Solid state devices, things like transistors, don't sound as good as valves or tubes as they're commonly referred to these days. Manipulate the signal as little as possible and provide the best quality components you can get away with for the price. It's an approach that's earned AudioNote founder Peter Kvortrop a reputation for being a maverick in the industry, but what's beyond question is that the brand has earned a stellar reputation for quality. I actually went down to the AudioNote factory to collect the Zero system that I'm reviewing today. I think Peter wanted me to have an appreciation of what goes into the development and engineering of their products. What struck me about that visit, other than the time that Peter and his son Daniel graciously afforded me, was the passion of all the employees and how much they actually do in-house. The products are assembled on the premises, there are various stages of testing to ensure everything is as should be, and final QC checks as you'd expect, but a number of the components are made in-house. The transformers are built within the facility, as are capacitors found on higher tier products. There are specialist machines to roll capacitors out of various metals from tin to silver. Even the printed circuit boards are CNC machined on site. Naturally, they can't make everything in-house, but where they're reliant on OEMs to supply components, invariably they're specified to AudioNote requirements. AudioNote also hold a vast stock of components on the premises, new old stock vacuum tubes that Peter has collected over a lifetime, and other components which in some cases are no longer in production. AudioNote have invested hundreds of thousands of pounds in buying up components that they highly regard. This ensures production and serviceability of AudioNote products for decades to come. I hope you've enjoyed that mini virtual tour. I wanted to know how the Zero series of products sounded in their own right, whether you could get away with mixing and matching them, and how the Zero system sounded as a whole. But there are 4 products to review, and that's likely to be information overload for one video. So I've decided to break it into 2 parts. In part 1, I'll discuss the 0.1x DAC and the CD Zero, and in part 2 I'll discuss I'm trying to remember all the names, I0 amplifier and the AX1-2 speakers, and then conclude by discussing the system as a whole. So let's get started. The AudioNote 0.1x DAC sells for £1,562 in the UK. All the Zero range units are 3/4 rack width and also available in an anodized silver fascia. However, I much prefer the elegance of the gold set against a black acrylic backdrop. I'm on board with the simplicity of the industrial design too. There's just one button to toggle between a USB digital input and coaxial. No optical input, probably because the conversion from optical signals to electrical can introduce noise unless well implemented. Good converters are expensive. The back is also far from complicated, with connections to the 2 digital inputs I just mentioned and a set of single-ended RCA analog outputs. It's a bit of a nuisance to have the power switch on the back, as this DAC has a valve output stage, so switching off when not in use helps to lengthen the life of the tubes. The 0.1x DAC uses the legendary Philips TDA1543 chip that deploys an R2R ladder conversion. It's no longer in production, but prized by many high-end hi-fi manufacturers for its natural sound in comparison to modern Delta Sigma chips that have heavily processed signals. All AudioNote digital products use no oversampling, noise shaping or digital filtering. In fact, the 0.1x DAC doesn't even have an analog filter on the output. The lack of filtering can cause a type of digital distortion called aliasing, but AudioNote believe that this is the lesser of two evils. The output stage uses a 6111WA dual triode tube running zero negative feedback. Triodes are the most linear voltage amplification devices there are, more linear than pentodes or tetrodes, much more linear than solid-state devices such as op-amps and transistors, found in almost every other DAC at this price. Another thing worth noting is that the 0.1x DAC has a bunch of AudioNote branded capacitors, including two very fancy looking large tin foil caps, most likely in the signal path and used for coupling between stages. This DAC is all about exquisite timing and a natural sound. It's the first DAC that I reviewed that has valves in it, but I know what those glowing glass tubes can bring to the party when it comes to amplification, harmonics and a 3D immersive sound. The 0.1x DAC has that. I wasn't expecting this level of resolution, not from a DAC that's based around an old Philips TDA 1543 chip, which, let's face it, is almost as old as I am, in comparison to modern Delta Sigma DACs or R2R ladder DACs these days that use very high precision resistors even at this price. I should know better than at this stage of my reviewer's journey to have these generalized preconceived notions. My reference DAC at £1,000 gives up a tiny bit of resolution to the best Delta Sigma counterparts, but the R2R ladder architecture of the Denafrips Aries 12-1 more than makes up for it in authentic tone and spatial presentation. As much as I love the little Denafrips DAC, it sounds soft and coloured in comparison to the AudioNote. Clearly, I'm going to have to up my game here. After many months of use, the Gustard R26 has shed that little bit of leanness it had in the mid-range. It was my main criticism at the time of review. The R26 has settled down to have a superbly neutral tonality, as well as the exemplary information gathering skills it has for £1,600. But the 0.1x DAC is better. You hear a little bit more clearly micro details and timbral inflections, things like vibrato in vocals, the resonances associated with air escaping from a brass instrument, the reverberation after a string is plucked. And that's using the USB input. If you use the coaxial input, it's possible to widen the performance gap between the Gustard and the AudioNote DAC. I say possible because the coaxial input is not asynchronous like USB. It all depends upon the quality of the transport and, yes, the quality of the cable between them. I use my Auralic Aries G1 streaming transport and an inexpensive but excellent Mogami Neglex 2534 cable. 8 out of 10 times on devices the USB connection will sound better than the coaxial, but the coaxial connection here has clearly been better optimized. It all depends on implementation. USB is electrically a little bit more noisy, but has lower jitter than SPDIF coaxial and optical connections. Engineering is always about trade-offs. But just how good is this circa £1,500 DAC? Is it as good or even better than the mighty Denafrips Venus II? That's the mainstay of my system and considerably more expensive. The 0.1x DAC comes close. The Venus presents a larger landscape in all directions with more accurate placement of performers within it. Vocals and instruments are also more fleshed out. Those timbral inflections that I spoke about earlier, they're better realized, as are dynamic contrasts. Listen, the Venus is the better DAC across the board, but we're talking about relatively small differences, and this thing is half its price. If you don't want streaming and extra connectivity and are only interested in a DAC, I'd take it all day long over the Eversolo DMP-A8 that retails for £1,890. The A8 also has excellent detail retrieval, but doesn't sound as natural as the AudioNote DAC. It's a much closer call with the £2,000 newly launched Auralic Vega S1 that also has an excellent streamer and analog volume control. The Vega S1 may just edge it in terms of resolution, but the 0.1x DAC is a bit richer and harmonically satisfying. Let's cut to the chase. This is a great sounding DAC. I haven't heard anything better for around £1,500. The AudioNote 0.1x DAC gets an outstanding from this channel. The CD Zero retails in Blighty for £2,169. It's a Redbook CD player that won't support SACD or other high-res formats. AudioNote consider anything above the standard 44 kHz 16-bit resolution to be a folly. What you get is a front-loading CD mechanism and buttons to access basic controls such as open, close, stop, play, pause and skip. The functions are repeated on the Audio Note system remote control. The same no-nonsense approach carries over to the rear. You won't find balanced XLR analog connections or multiple digital outputs, just one set of single-ended RCA analog outputs and a digital coaxial output, the idea being to execute one thing well. The CD Zero uses a Philips transport. The digital to analog conversion is done by the same vintage Philips TDA 1543 R2R ladder chip found in the 0.1x DAC, again with no filtering. The output stage also uses a 6111 WA dual triode tube, deploying zero negative feedback. With all those similarities, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the CD Zero should sound the same as the 0.1x DAC. You'd be wrong. The CD player is warmer in tone and isn't as resolving of information. To some extent, this is to be expected. The chassis is more crammed, the circuit board layout is quite different, and you haven't got those fancy Audio Note branded capacitors found in the 0.1x DAC. The power supply has to feed the digital transport as well as the DAC and analog sections. Tubes can also be microphonic, so any vibrations from the spinning disc mechanism are going to adversely affect fidelity. That probably accounts for the differences in sound quality that I hear between the CD player and the DAC, but this is still possibly the best sounding CD player that I've reviewed to date, not that I've reviewed that many. It's just that the 0.1x DAC is blow your socks off great for the money, whereas the CD Zero is just merely very good. It's a country mile ahead of the 3 sub £1,000 CD players I reviewed a couple of months ago, as it should be at approximately 3 times the price of the Marantz CD60, Arcam CD5 and SMSL PL200. As for other digital sources, the Eversolo DMP-A8 is probably similarly resolving, but sounds unnatural, thin in the mid-range and narrow in its soundstage by comparison. The Bluesound Node X actually offers an equivalent sensor scale, but isn't able to pull as much information off recordings and is tonally even more coloured on the warm side. I don't think people are going to cross-shop CD players for streamers, but I'm providing these as a bit of a sonic reference. Both these streamers that I've just spoken about are quite a bit cheaper than the CD Zero. In fact, you have enough money left over to buy an external DAC, something like a Denafrips Aries 12-1, and still have a little bit of change in your pocket. Even then, I don't think you're quite going to reach the performance across the board of the Audio Note CD player, and that's because the Bluesound Node X and the Eversolo DMP-A8 still impart some of their sonic character even when used as transports. A head-to-head with their Primaire CD15 would be interesting. The £1,650 CD player that I reviewed in 2022 also has great detail retrieval, a large soundstage and a tone that veers on the warm side of neutral. But I'm not a fan of slot-loaded CD players. Over time, it's possible that the gripping mechanism that pulls discs in could introduce small scratches to the surface of the CDs. You don't have that concern with a front-loading CD draw mechanism. If someone put a gun to my head, I'd have to say that the CD Zero is probably the better sounding player by a whisker, but I'd like to have both players in at the same time to confirm that hunch. All said and done, this is a very nice sounding CD player. The Audio Note CD Zero gets a highly recommended from this channel. Okay, so I'm going to leave things here for now. Look out for part 2 where I cover the i0 amplifier, the AX1-2 speakers and the system as a whole. I'm sure you know what to do. If you like what I do on this channel and you want to support me, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification. Check me out on Patreon, there's a couple of tiers you can access there if you think I can help you on your audiophile journey. Also check out the ABA Club on Patreon, which has some great ways to interact with me and fellow Patreons. But for today, for now, a British audiophile, signing off.